So thank you for coming back to the final session of today. And as you know, this session is titled Leveraging the Voice of the Labor Movement in Global Coal Transitions. And so here we are visiting South Africa, Chile, and Colombia. And we've had some shifts in the panel, which probably is a gift to us so that we can wrap up the day sooner. But that will also determined by the questions that follows from the floor. So just in terms of what the session is about, this session is about, thinking about as we transition away from the coal, from coal to renewables to address the worst effects of climate change. How do we ensure labor participates fully in the dialogue and planning of clean energy transitions, ensuring the active participation, and how do we support workers and the families and the communities connected to them in the design of clean energy policies, ensuring the co-ownership of the policies and the implementation thereof. So we'll draw on examples of South Africa, Chile, and Colombia, as I said, and explore the importance of social dialogues, showcasing best practices and addressing the challenges faced in ensuring meaningful participation of the labor movement in global coal transitions. We won't have presentations. That's the good news for this session. So we'll just have a round of opening remarks by our panelists. We've asked them a couple of questions. And maybe should I read the questions so that they know, again, what we're asking in the session? Or it's fine, they say it's fine. So we'll go to the panel. And first on the panel is Khwezi Mabasa from the Khwezi Mabasa from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. Matthieu Prin is here and he will come into the conversation, but he's giving the floor over to Khwezi to open up the conversation. Boitumelo Molete from COSATU was meant to be here. She tenders her apology. She was called away to another urgent meeting, unfortunately. So we'll miss her as part of this conversation. But Tendai Makanza, who is here from IndustriALL Global Union, and Boitumelo's colleagues, so they touch on the same issues. And so Tendai is an economist, and she holds a master's degree in economics, working, let me just pull that up there, working as a regional officer in the IndustriALL Global Union, Sub-Sahara Regional Office in Johannesburg, South Africa. And her role is focused on developing trade union sustainable development programs and strengthening competencies for policy engagement and strengthening, policy engagements, example, social dialogue on sectoral priorities, that is decent work agenda, socioeconomic justice and sustainable development. And then next we have Gerardo Ortiz, he's the president of the Colombian mining company SintraMined trade union. He's an industrial engineer by training and he's from the CESA Department of Colombia. And then we also have from Daniel Moreno from the Coal Power Union-ENGIE. He is a fuel analyst at ENGIE, Chile, in Mejilones, Chile. He's got 37 years of service with the company, and he's the president of the Workers' Union. He is the representative of the 7 workers' unions of ENGIE Energia, Chile, SA for the just transition before the Ministry of Environment. The 7 unions make up 75% of the workforce. That's about 750 workers. So if you two can also come and join us as part of the panel, Daniel and Gerardo. So we've been doing quite a bit of mental gymnastics with the translations. And so we'll have 2 translations again. So please get your earphones ready. So to start us off, I'll ask Tendai to come in and give us his opening remarks. Dr. Tendai, Khwezi.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I've already been introduced. My name is Khwezi Mabasa, and I'm currently coordinating the economic and social policy work at FES. But previously, I've worked in the trade union movement, COSATU specifically, and basically been involved in some of these debates for a number of years. So I think the first thing that I want to say is that the debate about the just transition in South Africa and in the global South is not necessarily a debate just about different technologies and moving away from a fossil fuel-driven economy, but it's also a debate about socio-economic justice. And in fact, if one wants to understand the labor position on the just transition, you have to make a link between the transition away from fossil fuels to deeper political economy questions or issues, taking into consideration a country's specific context. So if I was to look at, let's say, South Africa, I think there are four main issues that have always shaped the labor perspective on the just transition. The first one is this issue around work and livelihoods. And not only jobs in terms of the quantity or the number, but also the quality of the job. And that's why you'll always hear labor speaking about the notion of decent work in the context of the just transition. But also the debate about work is not only about wage work in the formal sector, in factories and power stations, but it's also about work in what is popularly referred to as the informal economy, right? So there are different types of work that we need to think about in the context of the just transition so that we don't limit the idea of decent work to just the formal economy. And this is important because it also genders the debate, because we start to include issues such as care work and access to public goods. And this must be considered in two aspects. Yes, there's a debate about the potential for job losses and externalities, but also what types of jobs are going to be created in these new low carbon energy industries, and are they decent, and do they factor in this holistic idea of work? The second, I think, important point that I alluded to in the questions that I posed before we took the break is the debate about ownership. And the debate about ownership in the just transition from a labor perspective focuses on a number of dimensions. The question about public or private ownership, especially because workers have felt the negative effects of the privatization of other essential public goods in society. So that's why, hence, there's a pushback against further privatization, especially in the energy sector, and the impact it might have on jobs, the impact it might have on access to energy as well in terms of the cost. But tied to that is also a debate around ownership between local and what we call multinational or foreign-owned companies. Because the idea of economic justice has to factor in how the just transition is going to alleviate global economic inequalities. And so this question around how do you increase local ownership becomes very important, also in the context of the just transition. And then even ideas about different forms of ownership that move us beyond our conventional ideas of ownership in the capitalist economy, right? So cooperatives, worker-controlled companies, community-owned initiatives, and there are some case studies and projects that speak to that. Then there is also a debate about the relationship, or the point about the relationship between the just transition and industrialization in the global South. And this is important for addressing historical unequal trade relations. And then the argument there is that if you improve localization and industrialization, you have the potential to create more jobs and also to address historical trade inequalities between the global North and South regions. And then the last point is the intersection between the just transition and gendered and racial redress. When we speak about economic justice in the contemporary world, we're not only speaking about class inequality, we're also speaking about inequality that's related to race and gender. And in terms of both of the cost of the climate shocks, but even when you think about the future of the low carbon economy, we also have to address those inequalities. Yeah, thanks. I was given 4 to 5 minutes. I hope I stuck to the time. All right.
Thanks, Khwezi, for that beautiful framing of the session. We're going to go to Tendai next.
Thank you. First of all, I must really thank the organizers for inviting labor. It's very rare that we find ourselves in spaces such as this, especially when we're talking about sectorial transition. I must emphasize that for me, I come from IndustriALL Global Union. This is a global union that represents over 50 million workers, including those that are in the mining and energy sectors that I'm trying to go and speak on behalf of today. I will bring the stories not only of South Africa, but of Sub-Sahara Africa, because I'm responsible for this work within our region, within Sub-Sahara Africa. And Khwezi, thank you for laying the foundation of our speeches today, because then I'll touch on a little bit on it, but emphasize, because for me, I think what's also important is to highlight what our demands or our definitions of what would be a just transition would be. I think first and foremost, it is important for labor to emphasize that there's an overwhelming definition when we are clumped with civil society. And therefore, when there's reference to civil society engagement, it leads to practically under-engagement with trade unions. And the conversations around just transition or transition in itself becomes focused on communities only and leaves out a specialized element, which is labor. And therefore, what we also believe will drive the transition itself, especially in a region such as Sub-Sahara Africa, where primarily our livelihood is labor-driven and as we are not capital intensive. And therefore, to say this means that this is why, in the spirit of understanding the social aspects of transition, trade unions coined the term just transition. And that's why it came from there, the aspects of social aspects of the transition itself. And I think as labor, first and foremost, we are very careful and cautious about when people say, oh, we are talking about a just transition because we believe it to be a site of struggle. It is an energy transition. It will only become just if certain elements of it are ingrained in there. And then we need to look at what these elements are for trade unions or labor that we do call just. Now, saying this, I need to also highlight the stark realities of Africa. I think when we went to the COP processes or the UNFCCC, there was enthusiasm by all nation states, including sub-Saharan African states, to emphasize the need to reduce carbon emissions. This hasn't changed amongst labor. But the reality is that Africa does have a development crisis, and it has an energy crisis, and it has a need to fuel its own industrialization and address its issues of extreme poverty. And therefore, we need at the heart of the transition something that will speak to the development pathways that will also help us to address extreme poverties and the inherent dual and enclave economy that Khwezi has spoken about. If we also pretend that the transition itself is not forming on already these injustices, then it will not deliver the development pathways that we are speaking about and proposing under a just transition. And therefore, we need to know this. This does not mean that labor does not also recognize the dichotomy of the global north and south, but we also recognize the need for good governance and good democracy in our systems if they are to be functional. A space that also trade unions continue to struggle with states in our own region. Let me very quickly go to some of the issues that I want to raise. Globally, 2.7 million mine workers in the coal mines will lose their jobs. This is a reality. We cannot run away from that. And then the question around transition is that we know that not all of these 2.7 workers are going to be are going to be placed somewhere. It was good that the session before us spoke a little bit about diversifying the economy, but the reality for labor, and I think as trade unions that are in the sector, we want to have a match. How many of the mine workers will lose jobs and how many of them will go into this new diversified economy? How many of them will be compensated? How many of them will be reskilled? And how many of them can be deployed? I think there is a lack of absence on impact assessment and scenario modeling, especially for Southern African economies, about the impact of energy transition. And we need this to be addressed as a way to help us to give informed inputs into the process moving forward. The other thing is that as trade unions, we do realize the shortcoming that we have, that we also have to be concise. For instance, we cannot just say we want a decent job, we want a just transition. We have to also be able to give the text to what a policy that would look like. And perhaps what I'll quickly try and put forward before the chairperson tries to remove me from the stage is just a couple of suggestions. First and foremost, I think we need to realize that in Sub-Sahara Africa, a lot of private companies in the mining sector, the big companies, will often say we are doing better, we are giving above the national legislation, we're doing better than the national labor laws. The reality is that when we look at environmental and labor law legislations in our region, they are far below what they need to be. So simply conforming to them is not sufficient, and we need companies to do more. The second issue is around the lack of transparency along supply chains. If we are not careful, the extractive industry for the raw materials that are required for transition are going through what we'll call blood transition. They're based on poor jobs, they're based on violations of rights, and the lack of due diligent application of the legislation. I think we must say that we're very excited that the German government has to some extent a due diligence law, but this has not spread as much as we wanted into the European Union. And neither has it spread to the other countries, especially China, that's investing in the raw transition minerals in our region. We also propose that whatever structural economic transformations, as Khwezi has said, have to pay respect to the history that is there to transform our trade policy regimes. We need to change that dynamic. If we talk about green funding, we have to be honest about issues of debt cancellation, transparency in illicit financial flows, the reform of taxations at the national level, who is going to carry the tax burden. And again, I think this is where trade unions are in up arms. Usually the tax burden will fall back on the workers, whilst we even worry that they are going to lose their jobs. I want to highlight that it is important for any governments, whether global, north or south, that are working on the issues around transition, that we do not therefore forget that the issues around energy transition must be interlinked to ongoing platforms that are relevant. I will state a few. The due diligence law is a must and is necessary and it's relevant and is needed now. We need to conform to the 8 core ILO standards. For me, though, as a trade union, I always want plus. We have a lot of other standards that need to be rectified and implemented. I cannot leave out the aspect of business human rights, especially coming from our region. We need to fundamentally address this in a transition. And especially I want to bring attention that the African Union is in the process of proposing an African business human rights, and to our disgrace, I think less than 10 African countries have signed up upon it. And yet we are saying that we want fair transitions, we want a just transition, but we do not want to respect business human rights. I want to end finally by saying, we are excited of the notion of social dialogue as trade unions, but we are also not cautious to the history of the lessons learned around social dialogues. And I raise this especially with the just energy transition plans and the investment plans that are being drafted right now. Very few countries, first in Sub-Sahara Africa, do have these plans. Most of the countries have no plan at all. For those that have done them, South Africa is for us a best lesson case in point, because they had to go back and begin to integrate stakeholders. Before, the process was not as transparent. This is Labour's position. I mean, we are here to be argued with about that. We know that Senegal, as I'm speaking, is in the process of developing a jet plan. Labour has not been consulted, nor has it actively participated until recently. And therefore, we cannot continue to talk about these plans and call them just energy transition plans if all stakeholders are not being engaged in social dialogue, but making it effective, that they are not talk shop platforms, but they actually lead to policy and legislative reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tendai. Boitumelo has joined us online, thankfully. So she's been released from her other meeting. So we're just going to ask the IT team to bring her up on the screen as I introduce her. Boitumelo is the Social Development Policy Coordinator and co-lead on climate change and just transition in COSATU Policy Unit. She also serves as a Presidential Climate Commission Commissioner. She also sits on the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, as a member, and EXCO alternative member, and she's the organized labor representative in the NEDLAC Development Chamber. So Boitumelo, if you are ready, can you please give us your opening remarks?
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's very difficult to come back after Dr. Mabasa has spoken, as well as Comrade Tendai. They have basically succinct the position of labor into their inputs so well that I don't want to be repetitive, but like the work that we've been doing, just thank you to the GIZ and the IEA for inviting us. We've done a lot of work alongside the IEA to champion for the language of just transition to be inclusive of labor. So as COSATU, what we are basically saying in this just transition discourse, both internationally and domestically, is that we acknowledge that the transition is taking place and that there are quite a number of climate adversities that workers and communities face. But in the interface of this is the participation of workers in ensuring that our responses to climate adversities and our planning and processes towards a just transition should be considered as an opportunity to build more inclusive economies, not only for workers, but for communities as well. And it is workers and communities that should be at the center of the discussion. In South Africa, we are quite aware that we are faced with a huge level of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and these are deeply entrenched into the system. So when we speak about a transition, we need to also be considerate of those that are burdened by energy poverty, those that cannot access energy, but those that also are unable to participate in the current economy, but the potential of them not participating in a low carbon economy should be one that we are actually considering as being quite quite an unstructured and unjust transition. So as we continue for advocating policies on energy transitions that are focusing on job creation, we need to also be very much conscious of the fact that organized labor in its nature, when we call for job creation, we call for decent job creation. And in this low carbon economy, if we can't achieve those decent work conditions, if we can't achieve jobs that are sustainable and reliable for workers in the current workforce and the future workforce, then it will not be a just transition. I think Tendai mentions quite strongly the input on gender. We have a current COSATU gender toolkit on the just transition where we conceptualize the importance of making sure that even in our advocacy and our promotion of a just transition, we consider the intersection of gender and youth in the transition and how it is that we can bring along workers that are women, workers that are young, that are marginalized into this low carbon economy where they can participate meaningfully and where their livelihoods are going to be secured through the decent work program, through a just transition. We speak about the importance of social dialogue while we call for workers to be at the table when we are discussing policies, frameworks, and financing of climate in the just transition. It's important that the principle of social dialogue in its entirety is respected. When we speak about social dialogue, and a lot of the times we want to emphasize that social dialogue is not webinars. Social dialogue is not a top-down approach. We need to go down to workers, especially in coal mining, especially after we've seen how unjust the process was in Komati, in Mpumalanga, where workers were not being part of the process and were at the tail end of receiving a Komati that was decommissioned with no processes or planning going forward. So when we emphasize social dialogue, it's going to be very essential that the voice of workers and communities are considered in their earnest and not just as a tick box exercise, as Tendai has indicated. And just as organized labor in South Africa, when we are speaking of just transition, even at the global context in the UNFCCC processes, Organized labor calls for a text that really reflects the day-to-day livelihoods of workers on the ground in the plant, and hence we call for jobs plans and skills plans, reskilling and upskilling plans that are going to be able to be a safety net for workers going forward. In our core advocacy for just transition as COSATU, we speak very strongly in our COSATU climate change blueprint, where we have 24 set demands that we bring to the table in relation to what it is that a transition looks like and how it is that worker participation can be influencing the overall discourse of climate change, both in South Africa, but broadly as organized labor. We also touch as COSATU on issues like climate finance, and in our recent publication towards a climate finance that is inclusive, we propose a social ownership regime where workers and communities are put central to ownership models that are going to be able to ensure that they are participating effectively in the transition, not only just as employees, not just as workers, but also as owners of renewable energy production in a way where they are able, like we've seen with one of our affiliates in textile, owning solar panels and renting them out to their employers as means of ensuring that workers are part of the process and that the transition is not coming to them, but they are actively participating towards a low carbon and climate resilient economy. When we see our affiliate, the NUM, in the coal mining sector speaking to just transition, we have reflected this in our blueprint chapter on mining, where we try to craft potential pathways for workers to transition into from the coal-intensive sector. We also need to appreciate that some of these sectors that we see the transition actively taking place currently are sectors that are highly unionized. And in that, we need to understand that it means that their wages are regulated, their working conditions are regulated. And when we envision a low carbon economy and we envision a future of work, we must be considerate of the gains that organized labor has had in these sectors. So when we think about their participation as workers going forward in a low carbon economy, we must ensure that there's industrial policy in place, there are labor market policies in place that are going to ensure that workers are not left to destitute at the long run. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Boitumelo, for coming back. Next up, we'll have, you can appreciate her for coming back. Thanks so much. Next up, we'll have Gerardo Ortiz from SintraMined.
Buenas tardes para todos. Gracias por este espacio tan importante para nosotros, las organizaciones sindicales. Es un trabajo bastante arduo para las empresas, para todo lo que se viene llamado transición energética justa. Les voy a hablar un poco de lo que se llama una convención colectiva y de qué se trata una convención colectiva, que va más allá de argumentos constitucionales y favorabilidad de la ley. Ok, proseguimos. Una convención colectiva es un documento que se plasma en acuerdos entre empleador y trabajadores para favorecer a la clase obrera y darle garantías laborales. Pero debido a todo el proceso de transición energética, se nos han formulado unas preguntas para favorecer o cómo va a ser el desenlace en todo este proceso. Para nosotros ha sido muy fundamental e importante todo lo que se nos viene, ya que sería la 6ª convención colectiva que vamos a firmar con la compañía el próximo año. Es un conflicto laboral entre trabajadores y empleadores, donde vamos a llegar a unos acuerdos y lo fundamental que tenemos nosotros es hablar de transición energética. En mi región, Colombia, y en el departamento del Cesar, solamente existen 2 empresas actualmente, que es CNR, que Alejandro Echeverría hizo su exposición hoy, y está Drummond, empresa de la cual yo soy empleado, y soy presidente de la 2ª organización sindical más grande, donde existen 14 organizaciones. Por ende, existen 14 convenciones colectivas firmadas con las mismas garantías laborales. Hoy buscamos firmar una convención que nos brinde las garantías que hoy nosotros necesitamos. Hemos tenido desacuerdos con la compañía debido a que queremos más estabilidad laboral y más sostenibilidad económica, que es lo fundamental de todo este proceso. inclusión a la mujer. Hoy hemos logrado que en la empresa se vinculen 250 mujeres a ejercer el mismo trabajo que hacemos nosotros los hombres, garantizándole el mismo salario. Hoy hay mujeres que acarrean estos vehículos mineros o estos camiones mineros de 100 toneladas de carbón y 250 toneladas de estéril. Impresionante ver una mujer manejar un camión de eso. Nosotros, gracias a la convención colectiva, lo hemos plasmado. Vinculación de género. Gracias a ella, hoy queremos hablar de transición energética. Pero en mi región se tiene que hablar de transición económica, porque nosotros no somos productores de energía. Nosotros exportamos carbón. De 44 termoeléctricas, solamente 5 utilizan carbón. Poquito, para lo que abarca todo este proyecto. Hoy nosotros, gracias a la convención colectiva, tenemos mejores prebendas laborales, tenemos beneficios extralegales. Hemos tumbado una ley de la República que desfavorecía a la clase obrera con los recargos nocturnos. Gracias a la convención colectiva nosotros la tumbamos. Hoy recibimos recargo nocturno desde las 6 de la tarde en mi país y actualmente se paga a partir de las 9 de la noche. Gracias a la convención colectiva. Pero son beneficios que son temporales. ¿Por qué son temporales? Porque son beneficios que solamente dura el periodo que se firme la convención colectiva. En el caso de nosotros, 3 años. Y de todas las empresas mineras que existen en Colombia, solamente el 99% de ellas tienen sindicatos. Y nosotros tenemos el vencimiento de la convención colectiva al término más corto. Como Cerrejón la tiene a 4 años, la Uso que está en Ecopetrol la tiene a 5 años. Hoy lo que buscamos es que se nos plasmen beneficios que nos garantice y que el gobierno se vincule a todo este proceso. Porque hablar de transición energética es tan fácil, pero lo complicado es qué vamos a hacer con el 1.000.000 de trabajadores que dependemos de este trabajo. ¿Qué va a pasar? Es la pregunta que les suministro en estos momentos, porque necesitamos que las economías verdes que están emergiendo se fortalezcan con el carbón. Con las utilidades que el carbón da en estos momentos, sean fundamentales para que fortalezcan a las economías verdes que nosotros hemos tratado de fortalecer. Nosotros hemos fundado vea la redundancia, una fundación que se llama Soverde, que hemos tratado de educar a estas comunidades para enseñarles qué es transición energética, enseñarles mantenimiento e instalaciones de paneles solares. Pero no contamos con el recurso, porque la visión que tenemos es al menos instruir a 6.000 trabajadores o extrabajadores. Eso es nuestra meta. Nos ayudaría a minimizar esa brecha social que hoy tenemos en la región. Por eso hoy direccionamos las fuerzas mancomunadamente con los demás países que se encuentran en la misma situación, porque todos hemos llegado a una conclusión que vamos a tener un tropiezo, que es económico. ¿Qué va a pasar? ¿Qué viene después? ¿Y qué va a suceder en el momento que estamos viviendo hoy? Hay una necesidad climática, sí, pero la única herramienta que tenemos nosotros los trabajadores se llama convención colectiva, porque la jurisprudencia que tenemos hoy con los derechos laborales también son violentados. En mi país hay una ley que se llama Ley 50, que da la facultad a las empresas de despedirnos, así tengamos una vinculación indefinida. Entonces, hoy está en manos de nosotros, de los empresarios, de las comunidades, de la ONG, trazar una ruta que sea sostenible, que nos garantice que no solamente sea este convenio que hagamos nosotros con las empresas, sino que internacionalmente haya unas proyecciones y unas leyes que también nos protejan a nosotros, no solamente las que tengan la OIT y los acuerdos con la OIT, sino que todos los países que están involucrados en transición energética también nos fortalezcan y nos ayuden a crecer. Muchas gracias.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Gerardo. Next, we will have another input in Spanish by Daniel Moreno, Coal Power Union-ENGIE.
Hola a todos, compañeros. Bueno, quería dar este discurso en inglés. Lamentablemente, los 5 cursos que hice, a lo que más llegué fue a saludar. Y al no tener mucho roce, también se me olvidó. Entonces, seguramente me vieron saludando con la mano, como lo hacía la gente antiguamente. Bueno, yo principalmente quería exponer, darle a conocer en realidad nuestra experiencia en el tema de la descarbonización de nuestra empresa. No quiero hablar, después voy a puntualizar bien el tema de la transición justa, sino que quiero abocarme principalmente a la descarbonización. Y la experiencia que tuvimos, la fuerte experiencia que tuvimos, porque de un momento a otro nos informan de que nuestras centrales van a entrar en un proceso de cierre. Bueno, inicialmente voy a dar una cronología de cómo pasamos de esto. Me quiero centrar en el año 2015. ¿Qué pasó el 2015? Nosotros tuvimos una gran fiesta, espectacular fiesta, porque estábamos celebrando el centenario de nuestra empresa, donde habían trabajadores que habían trabajado 45 hasta 50 años ininterrumpidos. Y fue una celebración en donde todos felices, todos contentos, debido a que era una empresa que lideraba en el norte del país. Bueno, quiero indicarles que ya mis compañeras de Chile hicieron cuanto mención en sus discursos. Mi empresa es la que aceleradamente está saliendo en el norte de Chile. Bueno, como ubicación, nosotros en el norte de Chile, bueno, siempre fuimos líderes porque inicialmente éramos la única energía, planta de energía que existía en el país, en el norte de Chile. Y el 90% de nuestra energía iba hacia las mineras, a nuestra principal minera, que es Codelco, que, bueno, en Chile se dice que es el sueldo de Chile. Entonces, había tranquilidad, quiero decir, en los trabajadores porque liderábamos el tema. Bueno, les cuento que las termoeléctricas que teníamos que en base a carbón, 4 de estas estaban ubicadas en la ciudad de Tocopilla y 5 en Mejillones, distantes más o menos como 150 kilómetros una de la otra. En Tocopilla, de las 4 unidades generadoras, eran más o menos el poquito más del 50% de la generación de la energía de esa planta, y en Mejillones, las 5 carboneras, era sobre el 70% de la generación de esa energía. Bueno, todo tranquilo, como les decía anteriormente. La empresa tenía contratos a largo plazo, 15, 20 años. Consumía un combustible que era barato, y que había mucha existencia en el mundo. Y nuestra empresa era muy competitiva. De hecho, después empezó a entrar más gente al sector nuestro a competir, pero en definitiva nosotros siempre lideramos este tema. Entonces, la gente, su fuente laboral no era tema. Todos tranquilos, como les decía. De hecho, yo 37 años cumplo ahora de trabajo en la compañía y no había problema. Bueno, nos empezaron a hablar acerca del proceso de descarbonización por ahí por el año 2017, y bueno, existía incredulidad porque ¿cómo es posible? Van a desarmar esta empresa gigante, damos energía, somos los principales generadores de esta zona, es imposible que lo cierren. Pero bueno, el 2018 nuestra empresa informa a la autoridad de que efectivamente viene el cierre. Y ahí ya empezó el tema a ser complejo para los trabajadores. ¿Complejo por qué? Porque empieza la incertidumbre. ¿Qué va a hacer de nosotros? ¿Qué va a hacer de los trabajadores? Si yo les cuento que Tocopilla tiene actualmente 25.000 personas que habitan Tocopilla, la economía de Tocopilla en la actualidad la mueve las centrales termoeléctricas. Hay dos empresas en Tocopilla, AESGENER y ENGIE, y bueno, es difícil. Primero, más del 70% de los trabajadores son trabajadores nacidos y criados en Tocopilla. Entonces, para ellos, salir de Tocopilla a buscar nuevas fuentes laborales es difícil, es muy difícil. Es muy difícil ellos tener que cambiarse de un lugar a otro, moverse. En el norte de Chile, las distancias son grandes, o sea, de una ciudad a otra menos de 200 kilómetros no hay. Entonces, es complejo. Además, que en el mismo Tocopilla no hay otras fuentes laborales y toda la economía, como le decía anteriormente, se mueve por las energéticas. Voy a apurar un poquito porque veo que me quedan 3 segundos. Bueno, lamentablemente, ENGIE, o sea, podemos decir que hay dos cosas. Una, queremos entrar en la transición justa. La gente asumió de que esta es una realidad y hay que asumirla, pero va más acelerada nuestra transición que el mismo Estado. Entonces, nos vimos enfrentados en el año 2019 que no había ninguna política clara de este tema, de cómo, digamos, descarbonizar. Entonces comenzamos, primero, porque además no había no teníamos instrumentos, convenios colectivos para poder asumir este tema. Y tuvimos que entrar en conversación con la empresa. Quiero decirle, independientemente de que llevo mucho tiempo en esta empresa, de que ha sido una muy buena empresa que asumió esta responsabilidad. Es una política internacional, digamos, mundial de esta empresa, y se sentó a conversar con nosotros. Entonces, empezamos a tener muchas reuniones con la empresa, muchas reuniones con los trabajadores, para ver cómo avanzamos en este tema. Yo represento a los 7 sindicatos de nuestra empresa, participé de todas las reuniones y, bueno, en síntesis, para no alargarme más, vimos 3 ejes principales, que era la reconversión laboral de nuestros trabajadores, la movilidad geográfica y, por último, los planes especiales de retiro. Entonces, esta era la secuencia, ver la posibilidad de reconvertir a las personas. Se hicieron planes de capacitación, se le consultó a todos los trabajadores cómo ellos se veían fuera de la empresa y cuáles eran sus expectativas, desde empezar pequeñas pymes hasta trasladarse a otras empresas, no del rubro principalmente, sino que a las empresas mineras. Lo otro era la movilidad geográfica, que era un poquito más difícil, pero que inicialmente sí se hizo, en donde mucha gente afectada por este proceso fue movida a Mejillones. En Mejillones, por suerte, en ese tiempo estaba terminándose el proyecto de la última unidad generadora que se hizo a carbón en Chile. Entonces se pudo reubicar gran parte de esas personas en esa central. Entonces fue un alivio que no hubo impacto, porque se partió el 2019 con 2 de las 4 unidades de Tocopilla. Entonces el impacto no fue grande, pero después, una vez terminado este proceso, seguimos con las unidades 14 y 15, que eran las otras unidades de Tocopilla, y ya ahí hubo un poquito de problema, porque no había formas de movilidad dentro de la misma empresa. Entonces, ahí corrió todo lo que era nuestro instrumento que firmamos para poder tener una salida, una mejor salida, que era poder conseguir algunos beneficios para las personas que tuvieran que verse en la necesidad de retirarse de la empresa. Bueno, este proceso en la actualidad se trasladó a Mejillones. Tocopilla cerró sus plantas, no hay carbón en Tocopilla, solo queda una unidad generadora de ciclo combinado, que es gas principal y diésel, y 3 turbogás de diésel que de partida rápida. Entonces ahora siguió el tema en Tocopilla, en Mejillones, y Mejillones comenzamos de nuevo con el mismo problema, la misma incertidumbre y todo el mismo proceso, con la experiencia sí vivida ya del proceso anterior. Y actualmente acabamos de firmar hace 2 meses un nuevo convenio de plan especial de retiro, y con la movilidad que ya hemos tenido, hemos reducido en un 50% la cantidad de personas que se iban a ver afectadas y que tenían que salir necesariamente de la empresa, con una movilidad interna y de reconversión. Es importante resaltar de que no fuimos en paralelo la empresa con el Estado. De hecho, avanzamos mucho. De hecho, tenemos cerrado empresas y todavía no parte la transición justa para nosotros. ¿Entienden? Entonces, hay un poquito de retardo. Va a llegar en algún momento, no sabemos si esto podrá ser retroactivo, pero las personas que ya vieron afectadas por este tema y ya salieron, no sabemos si van a ser incluidas. Y como última quizá unas reflexiones para las próximas empresas que vayan a salir de este proceso, es ojalá que los trabajadores, la empresa y el Estado puedan generar las políticas para que todos se vean insertos y encuentren suyo este proceso, ¿ya? Y no haya afectaciones mayores, porque es complicado quedar sin trabajo y en tiempos en donde el trabajo es escaso, principalmente en los lugares donde yo le indico que es Tocopilla y Mejillones, donde es muy difícil conseguir trabajo. Entonces, bueno, la invitación aquí, ojalá las personas que trabajan en los estamentos gubernamentales puedan llevar este tema y se hagan las políticas cuanto en conjunto y no por separado, en donde quizás muchas cosas de las que se hablan ahí no tenemos idea y no es lo más justo quizás para los trabajadores, visto desde nuestra perspectiva. Bueno, no los quiero seguir dando más lata y los dejo hasta acá y le agradezco la atención a todos.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing so honestly about the challenges of how to include labor in the conversation. I don't know if it's just me, but the mental gymnastics of having to listen through translation is a thing. So we've got very little time left. We designed the session a little bit so that we can actually have a panel discussion with follow-up. But in order to maximize this time, we're just going to go straight to the audience, and we'll start maybe with the online community to just check if they have any questions for our panel. And we've got 7 minutes on the clock. Mutsa? Nothing. And then Mao, if you can just assist us with a microphone passing. I wanted to know if there's any questions from the audience in the room. Is there nobody with questions? Alejandro.
Hello. Thank you. Very interesting, the voices from Africa and South Africa regarding the labor issue. I represent the private sector and mining companies. I work closely with Gerardo in Colombia. And it's interesting that I think it's a unique moment in where the companies, labor, and communities are very aligned, at least in Colombia, in terms of protecting jobs, protecting the environment, protecting communities. And where there's a disconnect is international policies, national policies, and let's say the market. It's an open question. I'd like to ask my colleague Gerardo. Ya te la pongo en español, Gerardo. But I'd like to also hear what your thoughts are from an African, South African, Sub-Saharan African perspective about this moment in time. What happens to workers? I mean, if the companies have to, walk out and leave, decommission the plants or decommission the mines, what happens to workers in the communities? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to compensate? It's a big question that I think is not very present in the JET conversation. And for fun and for the end of the conversation of today, I'd like to pose it to you all. Gerardo, digo que yo creo que es un momento único en donde las empresas, las comunidades y los trabajadores están muy alineados en proteger el trabajo, en proteger el medio ambiente y las comunidades. Porque en esta discusión nadie está hablando de qué va a pasar con los trabajos, qué va a pasar con las comunidades y quién va a pagar o compensar eso. Entonces, ¿cuál es tu perspectiva desde la dirigencia sindical en ese sentido y cómo podemos hacer para incluirlo en la conversación de la transición justa?
Buenas tardes para todos nuevamente. Para nosotros del movimiento sindical ha sido bastante complejo buscar estas respuestas. Gracias a esta búsqueda llegué a una reunión muy importante y gracias a eso hemos tenido muchas herramientas. Gracias, Eduardo, por ese espacio que nos brindaste, el cual nos trajo aquí a nutrirnos. Y eso es lo que estamos buscando, Alejo. Buscando acercamiento con el gobierno, pero llegarles con proyectos, llegarles con propuestas prepositivas que vayan encaminadas al porvenir tanto de las comunidades, de los trabajadores y de las empresas. Porque esto tiene que ser un gana-gana. Esto no solamente que se vaya una empresa minera de un país, cerremos, o una termoeléctrica que cierre y perjudicar a un sector. Esto tiene que sopesarse. Y eso es lo que hemos tratado de hacer con todas las herramientas que la GIZ nos ha brindado y a los estrados que hemos llegado. Conversaciones con Alejandro, también hemos llegado a concluir que tenemos una necesidad en común, que es el fortalecimiento tanto de las comunidades, de los trabajadores y las empresas, y que el gobierno tenga participación activa. Y esa participación activa, lo que nosotros buscamos del gobierno es garantías. Esto solamente es de garantías y que se respeten los derechos laborales y que se nos dé garantías de que nosotros vamos a tener una estabilidad. Porque hoy nuestra familia se ven nutridas y tienen una tranquilidad, es gracias a la empleabilidad que un sector hoy nos brinda, pero también buscamos abrir otras economías, porque nosotros no solamente podemos vivir de una sola economía y depender porque el futuro va a pasar lo que hoy estamos viviendo. Eso es lo que estamos buscando desde el movimiento sindical, fortalecer, brindar, ayudar y que todos caminemos y hablemos el mismo idioma. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think I'd like to respond in a way and say, when the world decided to globalize, we should have been aware that we were going to learn from each other. And therefore, we have learned that there is a world where there are improved working conditions. There is a world where there is more justice than others. And therefore, based on this, we need the private sector, sir, to recognize that where they are operating, where the laws are poor, there must be a moral suasion to go beyond that. And I think for us as trade unions, our role is not only to protect within the confines of the existing legislation, but is to also advance or improve. And therefore, we must always understand that. But perhaps my perception also has to be changed, because we also have, perhaps it's a long misunderstanding, that the idea of also corporate sector is to keep costs down and to keep margins up. And therefore, if improving labor conditions, improving wages, improving laws in countries where their absence is a comparative cost advantage is problematic, I think this is where we have the conflict. And therefore, I think we will continue to do that, to exactly advocate for companies operating within Sub-Sahara Africa to still go beyond the margins. Because even within Sub-Sahara Africa, we understand that we need to do more. And I think that's why we don't only contest with the private sector, but we also fight with the public sector. We fight with our governments for them to do the right thing. And I think I want to also end by taking advantage here of having the mic. I also want us to realize that, especially when we look about energy transition, I want to give an example of Sub-Sahara Africa coming to the sub-region, SADC region. You cannot talk about transition and phasing out of coal in South Africa without understanding that you're also talking about something that will have regional implications. Because South Africa and ESCOM also power the region. And therefore, we have to begin to adapt these things from one country to the other. Thank you.
Yeah, just to respond, I think the issue about finance and who pays, the way we should approach it is that we can't separate debates about the just transition and the energy transition and finance from broader debates about tax justice and redistribution. So things like corporate taxation, wealth taxes should become part of the discussion around how do you finance the social security that you need and support that you need in a just transition. So we can't separate that. The second point is also that I'm not convinced about this idea of an energy transition that's happening outside of an economy. I think we have to have a transition that covers all sectors, or what I would call an economy-wide transition. Because I think when we limit it to energy, then we limit the space for creating new jobs, for having different economic diversification and the likes. So we need to have a wider conception and not reduce everything to just energy. It's just that we don't have time to go on about this. But then the third thing, which is a bit more controversial, is that, in my opinion, with all due respect, I think that the current capitalist model has failed, both domestically and internationally. And even people who are supporting this idea of market-led development at all costs are even admitting now, even the World Bank, the IMF, that actually we need to rethink our entire economic model. And part of that is changing our view on labor and work. Part of that is looking at different forms of ownership also. And I think there are interesting ideas about new contemporary forms of anti-capitalism, like the circular economy, the solidarity economy, and the well-being economy, that might move us away from this classical market-based thing. I know it sounds a bit ideological, but I think this is the thing that we're running away from, that we need to also deal with.
Thank you so much. You can applaud. Boitumelo, you are still online with us, and we just want to check, as you listen to the reflections of the rest of the panel, do you have a closing thought as we close out this session on leveraging the voice of labor?
Yes, definitely. And I think just riding on my two comrades, very informed inputs on how we fund this transition. And I think we need to also bring the reality to the fore that there is a role for the state to play in the just transition. And that we, like Khwezi speaks about wealth tax, there needs to be consideration on the fiscus and budgeting towards just transition in our states. I think also we can't rely on a transition to be foreignly funded. So this can't be just another external project that donor countries and IPGs are thinking of, where we are not even able to direct the agenda of this funding and the priorities that they bring usually more often than not are based on what they want to fund. And it leaves out the priorities that that actual country really needs to be focusing on. And even if we look at the current jet IPs, in their nature, they're not very developmental in their nature, and they don't promote for a just transition for workers. So I think we need to start thinking outside of having foreign funded projects on just transition and having a state-led transition that is going to be able to promote development, but also provide for state sovereignty as a core principle to ensuring that workers and communities are not left outside of the processes of just transition. And I think that's it from my side, but just basically agreeing with Khwezi that we need to look at this not just as an energy transition, but a multi-sectoral transition that requires us to respond in a way that is holistic and in a way that will accommodate for all the sectors, because quite frankly, a transition is taking place across the sectors, and focusing on one sector, being too fixated on one particular sector, we are going to be losing out on opportunities to create jobs and sustainability going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Boitumelo. I just want to come back to our Colombian and Chilean panelists, if they have a closing comment for us.
Sí, bueno, no sobra de más decir gracias por escuchar a la clase obrera, gracias por abrirnos un espacio. No es fácil escuchar a la clase obrera cuando hay demasiadas alternativas en la mesa. Hoy nos sentimos privilegiados de estar aquí, organizaciones sindicales manifestando un punto de vista que es viable ante todo, y lo que buscamos es no acabar las empresas, sino fortalecer una economía, y el fortalecimiento se basa en trabajo mutuo, en equipos, organizaciones, trabajadores y ante todo el gobierno. Es muy importante la persuasión de ustedes para el gobierno de cada uno de sus países, que tengan en cuenta a los trabajadores. Hoy nosotros no gozamos de legislación que favorezcan nuestras garantías, pero hoy nos toca a nosotros buscar la forma de ser escuchados y que se nos garantice la empleabilidad. Cuando hay empleo, hay futuro. Cuando hay una economía que busca emplear, dinamizar, dar garantías a las familias, pensemos el mal más grande que tiene el mundo, que es el hambre. Y eso es lo que buscamos, derrocar el hambre para que cada país al cual ustedes representan tenga un excelente desarrollo y una evolución. Y para lograrlo tenemos que trabajar. Y estos son estos espacios, ver los puntos de vista de cada uno de ustedes para ver cómo podemos concluir en una necesidad que tenemos todos. Gracias.
Bueno, el sueño que tenemos principalmente, yo pienso que todas las personas que nos dedicamos a defender de alguna manera a los trabajadores, es de que en todos los procesos sea partícipe el trabajador, no quede fuera, que no quede a destiempo. Es importante que el trabajador se sienta seguro de lo que está haciendo y dónde está participando. Que haya empleabilidad, obviamente que eso es lo principal. Tengo entendido que las empresas están hechas para que las personas se puedan desarrollar, más que buscar su lucro cuanto institucional. Y como decía el compañero, no solamente lucrar y a costa de los trabajadores. Los trabajadores somos los que le damos vida a la empresa. Es importante también ver el tema de las remuneraciones, que hay lugares en donde es posible que las personas no se sustenten con el sueldo y hayan trabajos demasiado precarios, que eso también debemos, yo creo que es parte de la lucha laboral, el de que esto se pueda sostener de esa manera. La idea es de que seamos felices, y para ser felices, como decía mi compañero, hay que comer también. Y tener la seguridad de que vamos a comer todos los días y que vamos a tener un lugar en donde podamos cobijarnos y saber que al día siguiente nos vamos a levantar y no vamos a tener un problema de tener que salir a buscar el pan a la calle. Principalmente eso, y ojalá que les haya gustado nuestra presentación. Estoy hablando patudamente en representación de todos. Muchas gracias.
Thanks. Thanks so much to our panelists. We really appreciate your inputs. This is obviously the start of a conversation, and I wish we had more time to go a bit deeper and just dialogue a bit while we have labor represented in this way. And while half of the room is government, I think, but I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands. So let's just give our panel a round of applause. Thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of our day. Even my cell phone's battery has gone. How many presentations were we at? 14 presentations, 22 speakers. Well done for your excellent listening. You've listened with such care and quality of attention. And we hope that this conversation stimulated you. And I think the hallmark of an effective workshop or a meeting like this is if you come in and you leave with more questions than you came in with. So our panelists gave us lots to reflect on, lots to digest on as you go into your evening this now as we break. I'm just checking if there's any last housekeeping announcements that need to be made. No? Mao, did you want to reflect back some key themes from today for us? Am I putting you on the spot?
Thanks, Adelaide, for putting me on the spot. I love a challenge, but yeah, I mean, after this rich conversation, there's really not much to say. But I would just like to, reflect on what the day has been, and I would like to just specifically pick on something that Philip said earlier on. Philip said that in the start that the just transition is like a marathon, and I felt extremely triggered because I know how painful a marathon is. And this coming Sunday, I'm actually running a marathon, and I've barely trained. So the just transition is indeed very painful. It's not a journey that's going to be easy, and it can be seen from all the conversations that have been had here that, it's a very complex process. We might have the technology, even though the technology is becoming competitive, the technologies are becoming bankable, but I believe the real challenge is in the non-technological innovations that we need to invent. So we have the machines, we have the technology, but the technologies that are required are the non-technological innovations. Those technologies that can build social cohesion, can create different stakeholders to be able to work together with. In innovation studies, they actually say when companies compete against each other, oftentimes what they do is they focus on what happens inside their fence. But the real impact happens when companies start to collaborate with each other, when you start to move outside of your fence. And the innovations there have got nothing to do with your balance sheet or with the technological innovations, but how you're able to work with others, how we're able to get the license to operate, whether it's from communities, from other actors within your jurisdiction. So I think that today has been really a rich session, and yeah, the just transition is essentially a journey. And someone actually made a comment outside that the nature of the transition is that it's very complex. We need to work with various stakeholders, but how do you keep it simple at the same time? As various people coming to the table, decision making becomes very difficult. How do you work within this kind of complexity to be able to ensure that we have that system-wide transition that is required? And I'd just like to have one example. You know, a few years ago, actually not a few years, last year, one of my students, we did a field study in Komati. That was one of the mines that has just been recently closed. And we talked to a single mother who was selling corn, roasted corn on the roadside, how the closure of Komati is going to impact her. And she told us that her primary customers were truck drivers who were actually transporting corn, who make stopovers to buy corn from her. You know, but now that the traffic has died down, what does her future look like? You know, I would love to have communities in this kind of space to speak for themselves, just like we have the workers who spoke for themselves. Who is speaking for our communities? You know, we are worried about stranded assets, but we are also going to have stranded communities. So really, I can't emphasize the importance of diversifying the economy, because there are communities that are not represented. There are communities that we risk them being left behind. I think that really captures for me the gist of what we had today. I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.